Now that we had such a close look at stateful and stateless components, we should have a look at the component lifecycle, something I mentioned, but we haven't taken a closer look. So what is the component lifecycle? In the end, when React creates a component for us, that means instantiates and renders it for us, it runs through multiple lifecycle phases. And we can define methods in a stateful component only in stateful components because you can't define methods in functional components. We can define methods which React will execute, which allows us to run some code during some of these lifecycle phases. Let's have a look at all these component lifecycle methods and let's then see when which of these is executed. Important, as I just mentioned, these are only available in stateful components, not in stateless components. And there we got the following methods. Now these are a lot, as you can see. Constructor, component will mount, will update, did mount, render. You might know some of these. Some of these might be kind of intuitive about when they get executed. But let's still analyze when which of these methods is executed. And let's have a look at the component creation first. Not all these lifecycle hooks are executed there. Not all these methods are executed during creation. Only these methods are executed. Constructor, will mount, did mount, and render. Now let's take a closer look at that creation component lifecycle process. First of all, the constructor gets executed. And the constructor actually is a default ES6 class feature. It's not a method defined by React. What React does though is it creates the component in the end, so it instantiates it, and it passes on any props this component receives to the constructor. Therefore, if we implement this constructor method, and we don't have to, thus far in our demo project we didn't, if we do implement the constructor method, we do have to call super and pass on props. This calls the constructor of the parent class. And since we can only implement this method in stateful components, the parent class is this component object we imported from React. And by calling super and passing on props, things like this props, which we then need to use anywhere else in the component, get populated and managed by React. So always call super and pass on props if you implement the constructor. What else may you do here? And that of course is optional. You may initialize the state in the constructor. We did this by simply defining a state property, but you could also define this property here in the constructor. And in older code snippets, which hadn't access to the new JavaScript features we were using, you saw that you commonly did initialize state in the constructor. What you should never ever do there is cause side effects. What are side effects? For example, reaching out to a web server. So requests which come back and then edit the state of your application. That is the side effect. You should not do that in the constructor because this may lead to a re-rendering of your application and hence to performance issues. It may also lead to your state becoming unpredictable. After the constructor, another function gets executed. This function is the component will mount method. Now this is a method defined by React and it is available because we extended component from the React library. Component will mount exists for historic reasons mainly. You don't really use it that often anymore. If you use it, you would use it to update your state here, do some last minute optimizations, but still you shouldn't cause side effects here. You shouldn't reach out to the web. Now, as I mentioned, you don't really use it that often anymore. It still exists, but chances are you won't implement it in your application. After component will mount, the component will render. Now, executing the render method does not mean that it accesses the real DOM. I will come back to how exactly React renders the real DOM and updates the DOM in this module again. For now, you should know that render, executing the render method, gives React an idea of what it should render, how it would look like if it then reaches out to the real DOM and manipulates it depends on what this real DOM looks like already. If no changes need to be made, it doesn't go ahead and re-render it anyways. But the render method is an important step because it clearly defines how your application or how this component should look like from an HTML perspective. So it's in the render method where you prepare and structure your JSX code, defining which content gets rendered for this component. Now thereafter, React of course also knows which child components this component has. Because in the end, once you called render and defined your JSX code, it also knows which other components you included in there, like the persons component in our demo project. So it will then go ahead and render all these child components, basically executing this process for every child component. And thereafter, it will call component did mount to basically tell you that this component was successfully mounted. Now, there in component did mount, you can cause side effects. This is the point of time where you want to reach out to the web, for example, to fetch some data. What you shouldn't do here is update the state though, because that will trigger a re-render. So that is something you have to keep in mind. Don't call this set state in component did mount. This will trigger a re-rendering. And if you're wondering how exactly it would look like reaching out to the web and using the result from that web access, this is something we'll also have a look in this course once we start adding web access to our applications. Now, it's nice to see this diagram here, but it's still very abstract. So let's head back to our project and let's implement these hooks and maybe log something to the console so that we can really see the flow of our application.